Okay, Mr. City Manager, let's tee up the next item.
Thank you. I feel like we had the next item on that item. Our next briefing, staff will provide an update on several topics related to the upcoming budget, including a current look at general fund revenues and several examples of areas where we need to increase our investment in fiscal year 2022. We will also provide more detail on the planned allocation of local fiscal recovery funds that we received as part of the American Rescue Plan signed into law this spring, as well as feedback we received from residents during last month's town hall meetings. At this point, I will turn things over to Chief Financial Officer Elizabeth Raich to get into the presentation. Elizabeth?
The most wonderful time of the year. It's budget season, so I hope you all are as excited as I am. I do have folks with me to answer questions should you have them. Jack Ireland, Director of Budget and Management Services, and two of the Assistant Directors in Budget and Management Services, Shan Williams and Jeanette Whedon. Some of this may be a little bit introductory because we do have some new council members. It's the start of a new council term, so please bear with me. On the first slide that I'll cover, and I'm sure we're pulling up slides. Here we are. I'd like to go to slide 3, please. And this is a macro chart of our budget. Many of you have seen this, a total budget of $3.85 billion. And we've got really kind of two types of funding, operating budget and capital budget. We're going to focus today on the two that are circled, the general fund at $1.44 billion and our enterprise funds at $1.15. So I'm not going to talk about the capital budget or the capital projects, but focus on those two operating budgets. Let's start talking about revenue. Revenue for FY22, which is the next fiscal year, that's the year for which you will adopt the budget. As I'm sure that you know, our general fund budget is primarily supported by property tax, currently at 57%, and sales tax at 21%. Our planned budget for FY22, and that is because we do a biennial budget, so even though last year Council adopted the budget for FY21, we had a plan in place, a balanced budget plan for FY22. That planned budget assumed 3.5% growth in property tax revenue. But as you probably suspect, we may or may not achieve that now. We do anticipate our commercial values will decline, and some of the question is, how much will that decline be? Will it be enough to pull down our overall values, or will the residential values, which are not expected to decline, mean that we have closer to no growth or maybe a little bit of growth? And so we're talking with our appraisal districts and anticipate that we will receive those values on time this year on the 26th, which is the Monday, July 26th. And we've heard from the appraisal districts that there are fewer appeals overall this year. However, many of those appeals are in the commercial side of things. And so we, again, expect that those will go down, particularly in those hospitality, restaurant, retail sectors. There are a couple of things, though, on property taxes that may be helpful to us. Number one, last year, the appraisal districts, when they certified, were not done with all of their appeals. So when they were finished with their appeals and gave us a supplemental property tax roll, our value was actually higher than we had used in the budget last year. So when you take that 3.5% growth, we've actually already achieved some of that because values went up in our supplemental roll that we received. Our planned budget also assumed 4.4% growth in sales tax revenue. I'll talk a lot more about sales tax. Our actual revenue received thus far in FY21 indicates the economy is rebounding more quickly than we anticipated. Federal funds are available and will be used to offset lost revenue and ensure stabilization of the general fund. I'll talk more about that later. We also have updated our projections for FY22. So let's look at the chart on the next page. And I'll point out to you that at this point, we of course have not updated the property tax number. That will come when we get our certified rolls. But sales tax, we have updated our forecast both for this year and for next year. So you can see that that's quite a bit of an increase, almost a $30 million increase in sales tax in terms of our forecast for FY22. And however, it's offset a little bit by charges for service down 3 million, fines and forfeitures down 4 million. We continue to look at all of these revenues as we move through the summer, and we will refine all of these estimates and forecasts when we bring you the city manager's budget on August 10th. To get a little bit more into property taxes, as you know, they're our largest source of revenue. I've talked about that already. We divide them into two pieces: what goes into the general fund or general revenue, and the debt service fund. We have to pay our debt service on general obligation bonds. They're based on, property taxes are based on three things. They're determined, first of all, by the value that is set by the appraisal district. Last year's value was $150 billion. It's also determined by the exemptions the city council sets. We have a 20% homestead exemption, the maximum allowed by state law. And the city council on June 9th increased the senior exemption, senior and disabled exemption to $107,000. And then, of course, the tax rate, which is currently 0.7763 per $100 in valuation. And of course, that's something that will be part of the budget proposal and for council's consideration in August. And of course, we won't finalize what our revenue will be until we get those certified values. On the next chart, you see a line there that gives you the trend of our property values. And at the end of that chart, you see that $150 billion I just referenced. Well, what we used in the budget for FY22 and said we were going to do 3.5% above that was 147.4. But when we got that supplemental roll after all of the appeals had been decided, our values for FY21 were really 150. So we've already achieved about half of that increase that we were budgeting for. And so the question will be, given what's going to happen, and in talking with our largest appraisal district, Ken Nolan, he is anticipating that we'll be flat or slightly better overall in terms of value once the commercial appeals are done. And so will it be enough to get us to what we had already budgeted for? And I will continue to later in the briefing talk about it, but remind you now that what we were already budgeted for was a balanced budget, but it didn't include a lot of pay raises. It didn't include pay raises. And it did not include a lot of the investments that we've been talking about, particularly in the last briefing. The next chart shows the percent change year over year. You kind of see those 3 down years, the last recession. The question will be what happens this recession. It was very, very different, and it seems to have ended in a way, in terms of sales tax at least. Those are rebounding very quickly. So with property taxes, which is a lagging indicator, we will see what comes in with the appraisals and how long that lasts before we begin to see that growth again in property values. The next chart, we looked at our preliminary values versus certified values, and this is important because in a little bit I'll tell you a little bit about our preliminary values. We get preliminary values in mid-May from the appraisal districts. We don't get certified until the end of July. And there's something that happens between then, and that's the appeals. So that we call erosion. That gray line through the chart is the rate of erosion. So it used to be somewhat steady in the 5% range, and then it kind of went up a little bit, steadied out again. We've seen increases over the last 3 years. And going to the next page, you can see that our 7-year average for erosion was 5.7%, but last year we had 8.1% erosion from the preliminary value to what was certified. And so we would expect to get at least that and perhaps more. And so we will see, what happens with erosion. Now, it's an upward trajectory. We've been told to expect more. There's a little bit of play between the 152.6 that we need to meet our planned budget and that, let's say we got as much erosion as we got last year, and we say, okay, our potential certified value is 153.5. It's a little bit of play there between those two. So if erosion's a little bit higher, we might be able to sustain that and still meet our planned budget number for revenue. But all of that will be determined. On page 12, as I mentioned, the current tax rate, 7763, and it's divided between general fund and debt service at a 73-27% split. Now, I've put the averages here between FY 99 and FY 21 just to give you an idea that over time we have reduced our percent going to debt service, and I think that's been a reliance on maybe a philosophy that we ought to have a little bit less debt. So we have reduced our reliance on debt a little bit. Over the last 5 years, this is kudos to the City Council. You have reduced the tax rate by 2.07 cents or 2.6%. A 1 cent change, this is a rule of thumb for you, in the tax rate is $14.6 million in revenue. And for the current, based on our last certified rural average residential homestead of $323,813, so almost $324,000, if you were to reduce the property tax rate by 1 cent, it would mean that average homeowner, a non-senior homestead, would save almost $26 on their tax bill for the year. The next slide is just that historic distribution, so you can see that over time we've relied less on debt. The next slide gets into sales tax. Let's talk about that for a little bit. Sales tax is, of course, the second largest source of revenue for the general fund, 21% of the total. As you probably know, when you go out and you spend money, it's 8.25%, 6.25 goes to the state, 1 penny comes to the city of Dallas, and 1 cent goes to DART. It's volatile, and it's significantly impacted by economic changes, and it is where we saw the immediate impact of the COVID recession. And so, when we look at the budget versus the actual, we see that our FY20 actual was a lot lower than we had budgeted, and that was, beginning to be affected in March of 2020, and then, of course, the rest of the year. This year, we're rebounding more quickly than when we did our forecast last summer and put it into the budget for FY21. So we had budgeted 296.3, but we are now forecasting a $35 million increase in sales taxes to 331.5, and they've just been coming in strongly every month. And so we may update that FY21 forecast again. And again, we'll have one more month of data before we come to you with our FY22 forecast for the budget process. On this page 15, you'll see the history of our sales taxes, and you see the drops where there have been recessions, and you would have seen a drop in the very end of that line where I've got those 2 arrows, but for the fact that it is rebounding a lot more quickly than we thought. So this is a very different recession than before. And so we have updated these numbers from that 296 that we budgeted to our current forecasts. Our forecasts for sales taxes are provided by Dearman Analytics. Dearman Analytics is our contract economist. And again, I've said they're rebounding strongly, especially in large metro areas like Dallas. The stimulus funding coming from the federal government has a strong impact on the economy, but the impact may weaken over time. What we see when we have stimulus payments coming out is we see an immediate spike in disposable personal income. As the stimulus hits, it's immediate. And then we see a decay or a decline right after that. So we've seen 3 spikes in disposable personal income over the course of the pandemic tied to those stimulus payments from the federal government. And the question is, how much is it going to decay or decline as things level out and if there's no additional stimulus? Now, there's one thing we know. We know that the child tax credits as part of the American Rescue Plan will begin hitting bank accounts in July. That's more stimulative money. But there are a lot more unknowns than there are knowns. We don't know about a large infrastructure bill. We don't know whether that's going to happen. You read the news like I do, and there's debate, but not a lot of progress. That kind of a stimulus, it is stimulative, but it is a less immediate effect. That money doesn't go into people's pocketbooks and bank accounts immediately. It's stretched over time. So that will have an effect on the economy, whether there's another stimulus round, and interest rates. And the Fed is meeting today. I have not looked within the last hour to see if they've come out with a statement, but they are meeting today. Economists and reports have been that we don't expect to see interest rate changes in the next couple of quarters. And so we'll see what they will do about interest rates. Now, they have broadened their approach to inflation, and so they just don't seem as concerned about raising those interest rates as they do about the recovery and making sure we're continuing to stimulate and getting to a better place fiscally. I'll talk about the final bullet on the next page as we look at our sales tax forecast that we've gotten from our economist. So you see there we have several different scenarios, an optimistic scenario, baseline, and then the others. I'll talk mostly about the baseline because that is kind of the consensus scenario among economists. And, the majority of economists are going to be there in terms of growth of the economy and therefore of sales taxes. It assumes that soft policy landing, which was the bullet on the prior slide. Now, that is an economic term of art, and it means basically trying to avoid a recession by gradually cooling off the economy. So the baseline assumes that we avoid a recession by gradually cooling off the economy as the Fed works on monetary policy, et cetera. Right now, the economy is hotter than that baseline. We're exceeding baseline so far this fiscal year. And we have used that baseline for our updated forecast, and we're seeing that we need to increase our forecast in terms of revenue. And so we will, as I said, have one more month of data before we put together the city manager's recommended budget. And we will continue to look at that and work with our economist to make the best forecast we can for next year. All right, let's move on to another important aspect of revenue, and that is our fees. The financial management performance criteria include an item on fee reviews. We do an annual review of selected fees. The goal is to do it at least once every 4 years. And of course, we, as a default, would recover 100% of what it costs us to provide a service when we've elected to charge a fee for it. But there may be times when the city council decides that there is a reason to perhaps have less than full cost recovery. So let's talk a little bit about the fees we've looked at. This year, we reviewed the code compliance fees, we reviewed the Dallas Police Department fees, and the Office of Historic Preservation, which has not previously had fees, but we looked at some of their workloads. The full cost recovery of what we found would result in some fee increases, and it would add $3.2 million of revenue to support the service delivery, to support providing those services. We will include a fee recommendation in the FY22 proposed budget in August. And at this point, there is not a proposed fee in the following slides, but I'll go through and tell you about the full costs. So in code compliance, what you see is the current fee per unit in that first column. So for example, dog-friendly patio restaurant permit fee, currently $264. And when that fee was studied and the fee was set in 2017, we were at 100% cost recovery. Costs for that workload have increased since then. The full cost of the unit now is $591. So that's how this chart works. And so you'll be able to look through and assess that there. On the next page, you see a few more fees for code compliance. And I want to point out that first one on the page there at 43%. So that's an example of in 2017 when the city council said, you know what, we're not going to recover the full cost. We're only going to charge $100. That is 43% of what the fee study showed the cost of providing that permit is. So those have been decisions that the city council has made in the past. On the next page, you'll see that, there are no current fees for historic preservation. And in this case, we're still in code compliance. These are ones where there are no current fees as well. Yeah, page 22, Annie, I'm sorry. Code compliance. These are ones where we have no current fees. And this is the program that Mr. Simpson in code compliance briefed to the city council in April and that we're working through. And so in this one, we're showing you the full cost for these workloads. However, I will tell you that, for example, on initial registration, that's voluntary. We really want to encourage people to do that. that is an opportunity to say, you know what, let's not do 100% cost recovery. So maybe we'll do 0% cost recovery because we really need people to be part of that program. But then once they've had unresolved violations, we'll do cost recovery on those. So those are some policy decisions that we will be asking the council to make in the budget. Next page is Dallas Police Department. This is an example where costs can go down, and we are not allowed to recover more than 100% of the cost of providing the permit or the service. So in this case, we changed the process for providing these services. And we went to a system of electronic signatures versus taking paper copies of approvals around. And we also have fewer high-ranking uniformed staff involved in the process because we, of course, need them to be doing other work. And so that has lowered the cost here. And again, we're not allowed to charge more than 100% on these fees. I would imagine we will charge 100% cost recovery on all of them as we have in the past. On the next page, historic preservation. This is where we've not charged fees. There's no current fee. What we're showing here is actually, and we have a bit of a typo here. It says full cost per unit, but these are not the full cost per unit. The full costs are much higher. And so these are possible fees we may charge. We'll come back to you again in August and have it written down for you of what the full cost is for these and a proposed fee. And then finally, when we talk about fees, as you probably know, the city of Dallas was selected as one of 10 jurisdictions to participate in the inaugural Cities and Counties for Fine and Fee Justice cohort. And we reviewed fines and fees, residents' ability to pay, and disproportionate impact of fines and fees. And we engaged a lot of community and government stakeholders. The staff, Liz Cedillo Pereira, presented a briefing memo to the Workforce Education and Equity Committee on the 4th of June. And the city will discontinue, based on that, its participation in the Omnibase and vehicle registration or scofflaw hold programs. So what that means is when you have a ticket and you don't pay it, we have been putting you into Omnibase, which essentially stops you from getting a driver's license, and into this scofflaw program, preventing a vehicle registration. And what that can do is it has kind of that cycle, right, of continuing to create problems, because often without a driver's license or a proper vehicle registration, you may not be able to get to your job or to obtain employment. And so at that point, you're not going to be able to pay the fee any more than you were before. This would alleviate the burden on more than 72,000 residents. It does come with a projected revenue loss of $700,000. More to come on that. Let's move into expenses. So for FY22 planned budget, again, it was a balanced budget. So we balanced our expenses and we made significant cuts to things we might ordinarily do in order to make that balance. And so FY22 planned spending is $52.9 million, or 3.7% more than FY21. Keep in mind, however, that FY21 had a $27 million reimbursement from federal funds for some of these expenses. So really, when you look at what's supported by other than coronavirus funds, the increase is about $26 million to account for the fact that we will not have that $27 million reimbursement in the future. And this is something that's particularly important to talk about. And in fact, your last briefing was Exhibit A. We need to invest. And you're going to hear from us that we need to invest in FY22 and future years to address issues in the city, address pay issues that we've talked about in many different areas and market rates, to address neighborhood concerns, and to address infrastructure needs. We need to attract and retain talent. We need to invest in our operations so that they're efficient and they are resourced to provide the service that we promise to the residents. We need to invest in infrastructure, and we need to invest in the policies our city council adopts. On March 24th, for example, the city council unanimously approved a racial equity resolution. So that reaffirmed our commitment to embedding equitable practices in all that we do and tracking racial and ethnic data to support the city in the development of policy solutions that promote equity. The resolution instructed the city manager to begin working to develop a racial equity plan to serve as a comprehensive plan to continue to advance our efforts by embedding equitable practices in all city business. That plan is going to increase transparency and outcomes through timelines, measurements, and the centering of the community's voice, putting principles into action to achieve a collective vision for racial equity in Dallas. Funds to advance racial equity, which also supports the Resilient Dallas strategy, the Equity Indicators Report, and the Welcoming Dallas Strategic Plan, have been identified currently in FY21, and we are beginning to work with staff around the city to get that contract to the City Council before the end of the fiscal year. And our commitment to you is that as you adopt policies, we will come back, we will be implementing them. Nothing will sit on the shelf. We're going to make those investments to implement the policies that you pass. A little bit of detail on some of these. Personnel. Of course, we rely on our employees for everything. We have about 15,000 positions, and I just want to explain that really quickly. A position is not necessarily a person. A position is just that. It's a job to do. It could be part-time, it could be full-time, and they're not all filled at the same time. For example, sometimes we have trainee positions that are filled when we have a hiring class, and then we move those trainees into the full performance level position. That happens, for example, in the fire department. And so we have those positions, but our head count as of June 1st is almost 13,000 individuals, including those 12,379 full-time and 449 part-time. And our personnel costs account for about 70% of the general fund budget. That includes your pay, your overtime, health benefits, pension, life insurance, and workers' comp. Let's talk about non-uniform. We have been improving the wage floor for city employees for years, for multi-years, and we have increased that wage floor in our FY21 budget for all full-time and part-time, permanent, temporary, and seasonal city employees to $14 an hour. Our planned budget assumed increasing this pay to $15 per hour. Well, when we got the MIT Living Wage Index, and if you're not familiar with that, of course, MIT is the university you think it is, and they produce a living wage index, and we use that per a policy set by council to require contractors to pay at least that living wage. That living wage index has increased right now to $15.21 per hour. Therefore, we will need to increase, not just go to $15 an hour on October 1, we need to go at least to $15.21 per hour. We would not ask contractors to pay a higher wage than we pay our own employees. And so in part because we have a pension system that requires more of a deduction from salary than Social Security does. And so for our employees to have take-home pay comparable to a contractor, we actually need to pay more than the living wage so that when the check comes through and the pension deduction is there, we don't have employees that say, you know what, maybe I should just work for the contractor. The take-home pay would be larger. So right now, to get that extra 21 cents, we need to add $300,000 to the budget to maintain that parity. And then if we do want to consider putting that wage a little bit higher for our employees, we've done the numbers here telling you how many employees that would affect and what the cost would be. So that first row from $14 to $15 an hour, that's already in the budget, that $1.5 million. So we need that extra $300,000 to go from 1.5 to 1.8 to get to that 1521, and then thereon you can see what it would take to get us to 1550, 1575, and 16. On the next slide, we also, as you know, have done a compensation study, and implementation of that study will improve our market competitiveness. We've heard this repeatedly about the struggles with hiring, whether that's call takers or sanitation employees or others, and addressing market competitiveness is important in order to attract and retain employees. Phase 1 and 2 are in the budget. Phase 3 and 4 are not yet in the budget, but are needed and are more costly. And so we phased it last year because we knew we couldn't do everything, but we wanted to get started. And now we need to figure out how we're going to move on into the future phases. I will tell you, we've got an error in the third row of the chart in phase 3, where we say that we're going to address compression, and yes, that is the case. We're not planning to move employees through to reach midpoint in 20 years. That's actually what our current compensation system does. Our plan is, and our goal is that people will reach midpoint in 10 years or less, and probably less than that. And so as we implement all of the compensation study, the time to reach midpoint will shorten. And again, our goal is a maximum of 10 years. On the next page, let's talk about non-uniform or sworn employees. I'm sorry, no, I apologize, not sworn, non-uniform employees still. So merit pay is typically included within the budget to ensure we don't fall further behind market. And because, the market study and that compensation study is a point in time. So those merit help us keep up with market until we do the next compensation study. But neither the FY21 adopted budget nor the FY22 planned budget included merit pay due to COVID. Therefore, the full cost to add that 3% average merit plus the pension required for that is $13 million, $7.1 million of which is in the general fund. Moving on to sworn or uniformed staff. This chart on page 32 talks about how many employees we have. So as you probably know, uniform have a separate pay schedule and separate pension system. This is giving you some history on headcount, hiring, attrition, end of year numbers, and it's showing you what's in the budget. So status quo, what's in the budget that you adopted last year and that was part of the planned budget. What would that look like? So final decisions have not been made on any of this. This doesn't reflect any changes the city manager might make or include in his budget recommendation in August. But I put it there because when we talk about costs, we're working off what's in the budget. So on page 33, you know as well that we have a meet and confer agreement with our police and fire associations, and that had a new pay philosophy. And that was a market-based pay philosophy as well as step increases. Therefore, we put into that agreement that funding for it is subject to the city manager's annual budget recommendation based on anticipated general fund revenues, and it's subject to annual appropriations by the city council. So this last year, because of COVID, we followed the agreement. And we met with the associations and we gave the notice we were required to give to say, you know what, we just can't do that market change this year, but we're still going to do step increases because we didn't want to have the compression where someone had been here for 2 years and they couldn't get a step. And so at some point, new hires would catch up faster. And so we did fund those step pay increases, but not the market-based. And that was according to the contract. On page 34, though, let's talk about what it would take to get back to where we want to be with the agreement and being able to do the market. Our planned budget includes $6.3 million to fully fund those step pay increases given in FY21 and to implement additional step pay in 22. And if we were to bring back that market-based pay adjustment and step pay increases in FY22, we need $15 million. So that is certainly something that we are looking at. Other things that affect the budget that we will be examining and talking about in July, and that you, of course, will do when we're looking at the budget in August. On page 35, neighborhood concerns. This is important to us, and we do look at it. We take our data from 311 and we say, okay, what are we getting the most calls about? These are the areas, the top 10 list of most calls. And I will tell you that we have grouped everything else into all other service requests, and it's a large percentage, but there are actually something like 322 different things that are grouped into there. So there is a lot of information we have in 311. We just pulled the top 10, and then to get those percentages to work out correctly for you, we needed to know the total. That's what that all other is. But we do have some other data on other types of service requests. And for our new council members, I know that 311 will be able to provide you those by district as well. And then that top line of code concerns is quite a big number. So on this page 36, we've broken it out to tell you, okay, what are those code concerns? high weeds, litter, street alley sidewalk obstruction, etc. And so those are areas we look at as well, and we say, okay, these are huge concerns. We need to get at these issues. Street condition on page 37. I won't try to rebrief all of the street condition. You know about that, but we've included that here again, just as a reminder that infrastructure is a big need. And on the next page, 38, you can see that, if we're going to make a change to street condition and make sure that not only does it not further deteriorate, but it improves, it's going to take quite a bit of investment and therefore some real creativity in terms of how we get at that investment. Transportation, very similarly. They have updated the Transportation Committee and put out some memos about infrastructure needs, traffic signals, school zone flashing beacons, pavement markings. And, 700 of our 1,400 signals are more than 40 years old. It takes about $400,000 per signal to replace it. So that's what we're talking about. If you want rules of thumb, $400,000 a signal, we have a lot of need. The school zone flashing beacons, that's something where we've got 1,000 of them. They need to be upgraded. We need $7.5 million. It's $2.5 million over each of the next 3 years. The roadway striping, we've also talked about that, and it's been in a recent memo to the City Council. Right now, we need $5.5 million to address the backlog, but to keep current every year, we need $3.6 million, and our current budget is $1.1. So it's $2.4 million we need every year for vehicle lanes because they have about a 3-year life, and $1.2 million for crosswalks, which have about a 10-year life. So there is no shortage of infrastructure need. Page 40, technology, very similarly. We have recently been investing a lot more in technology, recognizing that this is where we need to be and how we need to be providing services to the community. Not that we will not provide services in person where that's needed, but technology is incredibly important. And frankly, we had been underinvesting in keeping up with technology. So we've done a lot, we've made a lot of progress, but we do have some needs. This is just a few of those needs, but it gives you the sense that we need to be intentional and be sure to invest in this so that we don't fall further behind in terms of technology. Fleet, very similarly. We had a study in 2018, Alvarez and Marsal, and we identified that over the course of 5 years, we had a backlog, and we also needed money over 5 years, about $300 million, just to get our fleet to the position of not being beyond its replacement year. And so when something has aged beyond when it should be replaced, it's more expensive to maintain. It costs us a lot more. It can get down. We can have trouble finding parts. And there are a lot of reasons to keep your fleet up to date. And primarily, too, because it allows us, if we're up to date, to focus on preventative maintenance, to focus on those things that are lower cost versus expensive repairs. And it allows us to have a much more efficient system so that for every department that's bringing in fleet vehicles, we're more efficient of getting that vehicle back to them so they can get out and do their work. We've made progress here. The council has made some significant investments in the last 2 years, and we thank you for that, with equipment notes. And so if you were to add together the 141,988 under 2019, that backlog, and then 2020, 2021, that's about $240 million worth of fleet needs through 2021. If I were to give you that number now, it's closer to 129 million for total. And so from 240 to 129, we've made about $115 million or $111 million of progress, not only with buying additional replacement vehicles and getting rid of some of the very old fleet, but by looking at the fleet and saying, do we really need all of these vehicles? Can we be more efficient? Can we use motor pool, et cetera? And we've made a lot of progress in addressing this. We've got to continue that progress. And it's not just the general fund, it is our enterprise funds as well. When their fleet is old, it mucks up the whole system for all of us. And so all of us have to do our part, general fund and enterprise funds, to get our fleet to that place. Moving on to the enterprise funds, Dallas Water Utilities and storm drainage. Our planned budget anticipated rate increases for our enterprise funds. So in water utilities, the rate increases for operation and maintenance with a focus on investments in the utilities capital infrastructure and fleet replacement. In storm drainage, the fee increases to address capital needs. It's to fund equipment and to increase neighborhood drainage maintenance. So on the next page, you can see what I'm talking about when I talk about capital. This is the capital program outlook for FY22 to FY26. So the blue bar at the bottom is the water utility, about almost $340 million capital program every year just to maintain our system, which is excellent. For storm drainage, a $20 million capital program each year, rising in the outer years. And in part, this is also for bond. We have some additional bond money in 22 and 23 out of the flood protection proposition. And so that's what we're putting into these two areas in terms of capital over the next 5 years. And it does drive the rate, of course. On the next page, you'll see that rate outlook. You'll see a blue bar for the Dallas Water Utilities outlook. So this is a percentage increase, 2.8%, then 2 years of a 0% increase in the rate. For storm drainage, it's an even 4.5% every year. We really need to build that up. We were not doing enough in terms of storm drainage management, and it's critical that we build that up and that we're able to have enough revenue to have revenue supported debt to do some of the larger projects we need to do. On the next page, you'll see the impact of those percent increases on what the utility bill would be. Therefore, you see the FY21 water and wastewater average bill for an average homeowner, $63.79 a month, going up to $65.58, but then staying level for a couple of years when there's a 0% increase, et cetera. Now, what I'll tell you is that these are not final. We will be looking at them again in the month of July. They may change a little bit. We'll certainly explain that if that happens. But we're still refining all of this, but at this point, this is what we're expecting to see. Sanitation, lots of recent discussion on sanitation. As briefed to the City Council on June 2nd, the current bulk and brush program is unsustainable. We're increasingly unable to deliver timely service that our customers deserve. The volume of trash collected is growing, and in 2017, it was 2 times the tonnage per household compared to Houston and 3 times the tonnage per household compared to San Antonio. Dallas has a lot of trash. Then we had weather events. We had weather events in June and October of 2019. We had the February 2021 storm, and of course the pandemic. Everyone's cleaning out. So that's compounded the volume, and it's cost us an extra $16 million for the sanitation utility that wasn't billed to customers. We also need to separate bulk and brush collections to meet CCAP goals for solid waste diversion, which is 35% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So what's our plan of action? This has been briefed. I'll go over it very briefly here. The plan of action: fill the truck driver and heavy equipment operator job vacancies now. We've got to better meet those increased volumes. In FY16-17, the department averaged 19 vacancies for the year, but since then it's grown to 33. And so, and then we increased starting pay to $16.50 an hour. But our local industry pay ranges start between 18 and 21 per hour with limited experience. So we're looking at that pay structure and figuring out what we need to do to attract and retain workers. So we'll need to increase starting pay to new hires and make equitable adjustments for existing employees, and then have a tenure adjustment mechanism for drivers that have varying experience and years of work. So that will have a budget impact. We also need to pilot the recommended new service model, which is monthly brush collection and quarterly bulk collection in about 5 different areas of the city. And so we'll pilot that in calendar year 21. We're developing door-to-door outreach before and after the pilot to help us fine-tune the program for citywide implementation in spring of 2022. And then we need to increase funding for future emergency storm debris removal and when contractor crews are necessary. So again, those weather events have cost us $16 million that wasn't billed to customers. If it had been, it would have been a $5.68 per month impact to the sanitation fee. So it reduced our fund balance, cut it about in half, from 75 days worth of fund balance to 39 days, And we really need to build that back up and make sure that when a storm hits again, we've got the ability to do that, and then we can recover through rates what we need to have in reserve. On slide 48, it's just more information that I just covered about what the new proposal is and the fact that we'll pilot it and, of course, get feedback and have outreach. Okay, let's talk about the American Rescue Plan Act. As you know, President Biden signed a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act into law on March 11th. And this pie chart here shows you what it was. You probably know all of this. You know that stimulus checks went out. You know that there was funding for unemployment insurance, renter and homelessness assistance. In fact, the city of Dallas right now is pushing $90 million in rental assistance out the door. It's a lot of work, and we're working with partners. That's funded, additional for that was funded by this bill. Money for the airports, lots of things were in this bill. What I'll focus on is that bottom pie piece, that state and local fiscal assistance there in blue. Of that $360 billion, the city of Dallas will receive $355 million. We've already received a deposit of almost $178 million, and we'll get the second half of our funds next year. Our proposed spending framework breaks out, and we did cover this in our May briefing as to what we would propose to spend the American Rescue Plan Act money on. But here's the breakout of what's in the plan that's on the next pages. The largest bulk of it for infrastructure, investing in the future. And of course, health and safety, keeping employees and the public safe. And what I want to point out here is that what's not included in that $82 million is additional money for homeless assistance that we will use from grant funding available, and that's $22.4 million. So if I added that $22.4 million, that health and safety category would be at over $104 million. Fiscal recovery and sustainability, lost revenue, $110 million. And then, of course, economic development, getting residents and businesses back to work, $48 million. This also on page 52 is the kind of tiered structure that we laid out for how we would prioritize those funds. So the first priority, of course, is that immediate need, making sure we were meeting the public health and safety needs. Then budget sustainability, making sure that we can continue to provide those core services depending on what's happening with our revenue. Tier 3, service delivery, prioritizing other programs and services. Regional partnerships, and I'll have some news to share on that. And then big swings. What can we do to make sure that this money isn't just for now, but it propels us into the future? Immediate relief, page 53. This is what we're proposing. We've already talked about some of it actually with you. Testing and vaccination and personal protective equipment. I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, why do we still need to be funding this? And isn't FEMA going to pay for this? Well, I have to pay for it somehow to begin with. And so that's what we're proposing here is we've got to continue paying for the costs that we're going to have in these areas. We will seek FEMA reimbursement. And when we receive FEMA reimbursement, we can then reprogram these dollars to some other need. But I have to tell you, we are submitting, we're not, FEMA's not necessarily all that fast in getting back to us, and we have been denied on a couple of our requests, which we're appealing. So it's never a guarantee that everything will be reimbursed, and so we want to make sure that we have to pay for it, or have the money to pay for it. So that's why that's there. If we get reimbursed, we'll of course reprogram that money. We've already talked with the council about eliminating our backlog of paramedic training so that we have first responders to be able to respond to people who need our help. And then we've also already talked about the need for ambulances. So 35 rescues. It would include everything we need in there, the stretcher, the life pack, disinfecting UV equipment. So that's $11.5 million. We're just behind on replacing ambulances, and it's important. And then we've got another $5 million in Dallas Fire Rescue for other needs that they have that are critical for them to meet any public health crisis. Retrofitting city facilities. This item is focused on finishing out some things that we started with our coronavirus relief funds, but we're not able to finish, didn't have enough there to finish. And so, but most of it, that's a few million, but most of it is focused on HVAC systems in our buildings, air filtration, remote monitoring and control, duct cleaning. Install air quality monitors. So we know that asthma and breathing problems are a contributing factor to a tough COVID case. And we want to be looking at the air quality in the city to address those issues so that we reduce the vulnerability in those pre-existing conditions for folks. The next two, and those, by the way, are all in blue because that ties to the public health and safety pie piece on an earlier chart that's in blue. The next are in orange because we consider them economic development. So supporting those folks in crisis, providing targeted and equitable workforce development, mental health care, food essentials assistance, et cetera, $32 million. We have a lot of partners in this city who are providing these kinds of things. They're incredibly important. And our Office of Community Care and other departments look forward to getting money directly into the places that really need it. And then we're proposing city council district funding for relief to small businesses, nonprofits, or impacted industries, which is a term of art. It's defined in the guidance as to what an impacted industry is: travel, tourism, and a few others. We would have this based on established criteria, and you would be able to evaluate the needs in your district and determine where we ought to target that money in your district. And so we would be working with you on that. We're envisioning $1 million in each district and $2 million at the mayor's discretion. Tier 2, budget sustainability. Partially replace lost revenue. And I say partially because the lost revenue is certainly going to be more than what you see here, but we don't believe that using all of our American Rescue Plan money to replace lost revenue is where we want to be from a policy perspective. And so we're proposing to partially replace that lost revenue. Now, if you were to ask me what exactly is our lost revenue, I will tell you right now, we do not know the final answer. It's not because we haven't done calculations or worked on it. We certainly have, but we don't know the final answer because there are still some questions that cities and counties and states are asking the federal government. So the Government Finance Officers Association is working with the Treasury Department to get some clarity on some questions. For example, they're requiring us to do the calculation on a calendar year basis. Our fiscal year is not on a calendar year. They don't match up. So we're having to pull data in a very different way than we're used to working with it, seeing it, and then our systems are programmed to pull it. And so one of the questions is, why can't we use the year that we are on and we're audited on and all of those kinds of things? So there are some lingering questions, but I'll just tell you, in FY20, it is much more than 50 million, kind of any way you calculate it. And so we will get back to you when we have some final answers on what the guidance is to let you know those numbers. Tier 3, service delivery. We really didn't have a whole lot here, but we've got some infrastructure in terms of technology. We have some things in technology that we put into place during the Coronavirus Relief Fund that require some ongoing costs. And we also have additional city services that would be good to have online so that people can access in that way, don't have to come down to City Hall necessarily, et cetera. So we'll be working through that. Tier 4, regional partnerships. I met with the CFOs of our regional partners, the county, the housing authority, the school districts, et cetera. And I shouldn't say county, I should say counties, because we also had Colin and Denton in the meeting. And we talked about ways we could partner, and particularly with Digital Divide, we had just such a great conversation and interest from everybody to help us there. So we have earmarked some money for our partnerships there, and $3 million for the park department to improve the Wi-Fi at their facilities. And as you may recall, with the coronavirus relief funds, we focused a lot on libraries and some other facilities to have that Wi-Fi extend to the parking lot. Now we're talking about doing more of that at park facilities, and then a $40 million placeholder for other, because this is an issue we've got to get at. The next one, though, is not in a color that corresponds to that chart because it's grant money. It's not part of that $355 million. This is the $22.4 million in grant money that I said we would be addressing, put toward addressing homelessness with a rapid rehousing program. And negotiations and planning with our partners, MDHA and the county, continue on this program. And we'll be excited to brief this to you at the beginning of August. But we are committing our grant money to that and believe that it will be really a game changer in the city for homelessness. And then tier 5 are big swings. We've already briefed you on the first bullet there, which is extending DWU water and wastewater service to occupied areas of the city that are currently unserved. So we've got people who are on well and septic tank, and we are going to extend water and sewer to those areas and to their homes. It's a little under 500 homes would be affected, and this will bring water and sewer to them. Incredibly important, and ultimately will help us have equity in the city. And then we have other investments in the future. You may remember in May when I briefed, we said we wanted to put $20 million toward economic development. I apologize. I spoke before I got the Treasury guidance. I received the Treasury guidance, and the things that we were talking about putting that money toward are not allowed under the federal guidance. Therefore, we anticipate this money will be for infrastructure, that it will be toward the purpose of economic development, but that it needs to be in water and sewer potentially. And so we're not sure how that will play out exactly. We want to support economic development. We want to figure that out. But at the moment, the guidance does not allow us to, for example, fund the new entity or an incubation hub or anything like that. And so we really have to follow that guidance. And so we will be working through that and anticipate that money will be for infrastructure to support economic development. Moving on to community engagement. This year we had teletown hall meetings, and we called out to all areas of the city. We had 3 different meetings. We did them at different times of day, and we particularly targeted our Tuesday 9 a.m. session towards seniors. We did reach more than 17,000 residents. We had almost 1,700 Spanish speakers and 6,200 seniors. During our Q&A in those town hall meetings, which is what we spent most of the time on, is we were there to listen. And we heard from residents who needed help with home repairs. They needed help with small jobs around the yard. They needed rental and housing assistance, employment services. We had our operators take down a lot of names and numbers so city departments could get back to people and connect them with those resources. We also heard concerns about street and alley conditions, property taxes, garbage and bulk brush pickup, 911 wait times, neighbors experiencing homelessness, all of those things that we've had recent conversations with you about. And so I don't think any of that's a surprise to you. We heard support. We had folks who spoke up and said, let's support our parks, our libraries, the CCAP, recreational programs, especially for children and teens. And then we conducted some polling questions around the value of city services. The first question we asked and the last question we asked, so the first one was sort of before we started taking Q&A, and the last one was the last thing we did, was about taxes. Thinking about all city services, what do you agree with? You prefer to lower, even if it means cutting? You prefer to keep them about the same, or you prefer to raise to allow us to offer more services? And on the next chart, these are before and after charts. So the left side is before we made the presentation and answered questions. Here were the answers to that question about taxes. That 51.1% say they prefer to keep taxes and services the same, 19.1% prefer to raise them, and 29.7% prefer to lower them. Well, after the presentation, the number changed a little bit. So the 19.1% didn't change with people who want to raise taxes, but 54.3% now want to keep taxes and services about the same, and those that preferred to lower went down a little bit, which was really interesting. And I think, and by the way, the people who answered in this data, it is the same people. We went back and we had our teletown hall vendor make sure that in the polling questions, we took out anybody who only answered question 1, anybody who only answered question 5. So this data is the same people answering both questions. We did that because we knew some people might come late to the call or leave early. And so we wanted to make sure we had comparable data to show you, just because it's interesting to see what happens when they hear discussion about all of the things that need taken care of and what that does. And then our second question was about financial situation. Has it gotten worse because of COVID-19? And so we've divided the data for you here with under 65 and over 65. And I think what's interesting is that more residents age 65 plus said that COVID has not negatively impacted their financial situation. Makes a lot of sense. It's the power of pensions. It's the power of Social Security that, folks who are older and who are retired and getting one of those benefits have more financial stability. It may not be as much as they want in terms of income, but it's regular and steady. And then on the next page, similar kinds of results play out here. Are you having problems paying for necessities because of COVID? And again, those over 65 had fewer problems paying for necessities. But we do have some who are having some problems, significant problems paying for necessities. Then we asked about internet access. How do you access the internet? This pie chart shows how it breaks out. 7.6% of the folks participating in the call had no access. We know that in the city, it's closer to about 25% that don't have access at home. But I am proud that we did get to 7.6% of people who wouldn't have been able to participate on an online type of a session from their home. But because we called out on the telephone, both landline and mobile, we were able to access a portion of the population that might otherwise not be in these meetings. So I was happy about that. The page 66, we also have a survey out, and so that's still running. It'll run through the 23rd, same kinds of questions, and so we encourage folks to respond to that survey online. And then on page 67, we have next steps. Well, we're going to have discussions with each of you to talk about your budget priorities. We would like to know, what are your very top priorities for inclusion in the budget? To the extent that we can take care of those and make them part of the budget, that will save some work in August for you, frankly, of wanting to propose amendments and those kinds of things. And so we really want to know, what are those must-haves for each council member so that we can program those in to the extent that we can. Now, if you ask me to cut taxes by a whole lot, but also increase spending by $100 million, I'm going to have a little trouble trying to balance that. But so we'll do our best, but maybe we can do some of each, or maybe we can figure out how to make it work. But I really need to know, what are your top priorities? So I'll look forward to meeting with you in the next few weeks to talk about those. We'll also be coming to you with an item on the 23rd of June for appropriation of that first tranche of money, so we can get started on those water projects, for example, taking water to unserved areas. We can get started on paramedic training and some of those other things we know we're doing right away. And then you've been asked to submit your budget town hall meeting dates and times to the MCC director, Carrie Prysock, by the 30th of June. Work with your staff on that. And those meetings are scheduled from the 12th of August through the 26th of August. Then, of course, we will be working on the budget over the month of July, and we will receive the certified property values on the 26th of July. That allows us to kind of lock in our revenue estimate and make final tweaks to what we put together and present to you as the city manager's recommended budget on August 10th. We will provide the materials to you and to residents on the 6th of August. Those are our next steps. And Annie, do we have that next slide? I know we had some requests for exactly what are the dates for all of the budget items. These are the dates coming up from where we are now through the end of September, so that you know when we're going to do each thing that we're doing, whether it's town halls or public hearings or adopting the budget and considering amendments. With that, I am finished with the presentation and more than happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, members, any questions? Ms. Mendelson.
So nobody wants to go first, huh? Okay, well, I have questions. Well, I'm just going to start off with my little proclamation on budget priorities. I think I have already said it once before. I'm going to say it again because I think it's important to be said. I have 7. One of them we've already done. We've already increased our senior and disabled homestead exemption. So now I only have 6. The first is to decrease our property tax. The reality is, even when you show the pie chart and you get feedback saying people would generally like to keep the property tax the same, Property values have increased enough in some areas, including mine, very significantly, that if we kept it generally the same, it's a huge increase. And so the only way to adjust is to reduce our tax rate, and I'm looking to see that at least one full penny. Market pay for uniformed officers. We made a unanimous agreement with the last council that we would maintain market pay. While there was an exception in there that if the city wasn't fiscally able to meet that obligation, that we wouldn't have to. But the truth is, we have 30 million extra dollars this year that we could have gone back to do, but we aren't. We need to live up to our commitment. We also need to make sure we're not losing officers to surrounding cities. We're getting right back into the same situation. And when we look at our numbers, 2019, we had 3,101 sworn officers. 2020, 3,126. 2021, 3,092. They're leaving at a rate of almost 2 to 1 of what we're hiring. We have to make sure we're paying a market rate. Number 4, we need to hire more officers. So the budgeting schedule we've been using is quantifying a number of how many we'd like to target to hire, but that never takes into account how many we lose. And what we need to do is set a hiring goal. So the number of filled positions, and I'm hoping we'll say that number is 3,200. And whether that means we hire a few or that means we have to hire a lot, depending on our turnover, that's the number I think we should get to that level of strength and then see what happens with our response time, see what happens with our crime rate. Number 5, we have to fund the basics of our street maintenance, our street markings, and our traffic signals. You know, 70% of our traffic signals are over 30 years old. Traffic signals have a useful life of 20 to 25 years. This is shocking. And we talk about Vision Zero, we talk about safety. We were just talking about pedestrian safety, even with our sidewalks. Traffic signals directly affect safety. Street markings, I mean, how are people even getting across the street when it's not even marked? Lane markings. And I'm sorry, I don't know if Gus is still on, but I think the number is something like 70% of the street markings in our city are not clearly visible anymore. So it's not even a super expensive item, but it's something that's necessary for us to do. Street maintenance, again, we're all recently off the campaign trail. If you didn't hear about streets in your campaign, I would be shocked. We are not even funding street maintenance at a level that stops it from degrading further. We have to at least fully fund it so it doesn't get worse. So I know it's a big dollar amount, but it's required. That's what our job is. This is in the scope of what our responsibility is. No other entity is going to help us do that. And maintaining city assets in good repair. Every single taxpayer in this city has helped build our assets, purchase our assets, and we have to take care of them. And if we can't, we shouldn't have them. We should sell them. We should somehow convey them to another organization. But just like we have to take care of our home, and there's a cost for maintenance, the same thing for our own city assets. The last one is to adequately fund homeless services. We have a responsibility to the people in our city. We can't solve every single social problem with a city budget, right? Some things are for the county, some things for schools, some things are for the national government. But for city things, we do have a responsibility to our homeless and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to access shelter, to find a pathway to housing, I think is our both moral and our fiscal responsibility. So for specific questions, I'm almost out of time. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna give up my time now and I'll come back on round 2. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation. And I said this a couple of years ago, and I'm gonna say it again now. The campaign is over and it's time to govern. And I simply say that because hopefully during the presentation, many of you who are new to the council saw the facts about what's included in the budget, what the facts about how we fund public safety. So that's all I'm gonna say about that. A couple of things, because this is very high level and we'll get much deeper in the weeds over the next 2 or 3 months. I'll start with page 51. And I made note of this, the $22.4 million in homeless services that was not included in the particular slide. Can you talk a little bit about that? Not specifics per se, but since it wasn't included, you said included. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. There are two different sources for that funding. The CARES Act had ESG grant funding in the amount of $4.2 million, which we plan to use for, and then the American Rescue Plan Act home funding of $18.2 million. That's that $22.4 million in grant funding that we have committed to this project. And so it did come out of those two bills from the federal government, but it's in those HUD grants. And I know that our Chief of Staff, Kim Tolbert, has been working with our partners, MDHA and the county and others, on this. And I'd like to ask Kim, do you have additional information you'd like to share at this time?
Good afternoon. This is Kimberly Visor Tolbert, Chief of Staff. Thank you, Elizabeth. Councilmember Thomas, we are working over the next few months to what I would say bring to the City Council a comprehensive approach for how those dollars will actually be spent and the value that we're looking to get for those dollars. And so we're working through it now, and hopefully we will have most of that wrapped up over the next couple of weeks to where we can again be able to share that with the City Council in greater detail right after you return from recess. So I'm looking at an August 4th date that we will be able to come and fully brief you on how those funds will be utilized.
This is related to the conversation we had the other day. Okay, that's
Yes,
what I
sir.
wasn't sure on.
That's exactly right.
I didn't see it in the slide and it wasn't, laid out, so I got you. All right, and just going on the record, I'm really excited. I think the council will also, and the mayor, will be excited about this, what I like to call a collective impact model for ending homelessness in the city of Dallas. All right, next page.
Thank you.
Page 53, and these questions are for Elizabeth. I noticed there were 2 items on this page in gold. If you could give us just a little bit more information about that. Workforce development has been a priority for mine for over, since I've almost been on the council. And so when I saw that along with those other things, I wanted to find out, is this collective, is this individually? What's the thought process on those individual items? And we'll start with the first one, then talk about the second one.
Certainly, thank you. These 2 items, we have not completely defined exactly what this will be. So we've almost got placeholders here, and we're interested in your feedback on these items. So that's the first thing I want to say is that we wanted to have this conversation and hear from you about these items. The second thing I'll say is related to the federal guidance and what is allowed for the money to be used for. When we are helping folks, in terms of dealing with the economic effects of COVID, we have to target that money toward individuals who either lost a job due to COVID, were unemployed due to COVID, or their business lost revenue due to COVID. So there is a lot in the guidance about a specific tie to COVID. The guidance also has specific language about disparate impacts in the community and making sure we are using data to address the fact that parts of the community may have had disparate impact and that we are to target this money toward those areas that were most impacted by COVID.
Okay, thank you. My first response, I'm gonna definitely give you some feedback on that first one, and then the second one, hopefully Dr. Johnson and maybe Jessica are on the line, and they can get queued up in the meantime. When we talk about workforce development, especially equitable workforce development, my recommendation is we include funding for wraparound services. A lot of our organizations that are doing workforce development, especially community-based organizations, many individuals, they have to purchase bus cards, they have to purchase gas cards, if we're going to really break generational curses, we're going to play a role in lifting individuals who are suffering historically from poverty, then we've got to make sure that these services are available. A good model is what the United Way is doing in partnership with PepsiCo, this Southern Dollars initiative, where they're taking 500 single female heads of households and putting them through workforce development training, and they're providing wraparound services and support for them. So this will definitely assist them in breaking not only generational cycles of poverty, but a two-gen approach. While their children are getting educated, then they're getting educated as well. So I think this is definitely a model we need to look at. I would even consider you having a conversation with someone over at the United Way and looking at how they're putting that proposal together. But we must include wraparound services in any proposal that we provide related to workforce development. Second, if we could bring that slide back up, I didn't write it down. I want to go over that second bullet. I think nonprofits and small business. So let's start with Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, you online? If not, Robin Bentley, someone in economic development?
I will tell you, Thomas, while they're getting on the line, hopefully, that what the guidance allows are either loan or grant programs. So if we, were to do something along those lines, it could be a forgivable loan, it could be a grant, et cetera. And so we've not worked through the details of what we might do, but we know that from our coronavirus relief funds, we took applications from small businesses. We went out with RFPs for nonprofits. And so I would imagine we would follow a similar approach this time, but working with the council districts, determining whether a particular council district area had more of a need in small business or more of a need in impacted industries. We're a very diverse community, and so wanted to work with you to make sure we targeted those dollars into the programs that you thought would best work in your district.
Well, if you could relay this to them, I'm going to respond as it relates to the small business first, and then as it relates to nonprofits. What I was going to ask is surveys. These businesses these small businesses that either somehow received the Small Business Continuity Fund, or others who even applied, if we could do a survey, if we could find out from them where they are now, how they've been helped, and if they're still in need of help, because when we talk about targeting these dollars, we want to make sure they're going to areas where it's most needed. And as it relates to nonprofits, same thing, and that's why I was asking for Jessica Galashaw, a survey to go out to the nonprofits that have received funding to provide food distribution, other services, even those nonprofits that have applied. If we can get a survey to them to find out those who are providing services for, how are they, where are they, and things of that nature. So that's my time, Mr. Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Mayor. Great job, as always, Elizabeth. My notes are a little scattered, so I'm just going to go off the slides and just hit it that way. And I'm just mostly comments and a couple questions. So there are some concerns I have with the fee increases, especially for our mobile food trucks and carts and restaurants. I think some of these are more than doubling. And with them trying to come back from COVID, I have some concerns with that on slides 20 and 21, and I'll just send those to you directly, and I guess to council if they want to see my recommendations. On slide 24, you talk about historic preservation fees for, I think this is coming out of historic preservation and out of new construction. I'm wondering if so you've got a charge of $1,500 for anyone who's going to demo or remove a property. Could removal be for moving like a house that would otherwise be demoed, so like a house that we're trying to preserve? would that fee go to that as well?
I'd like to ask if we have Murray Miller on the phone to help me with that question. I will have to get back to you,
It's
Mr.
Murray
West.
Miller, Office of Historic Preservation. Councilmember West, thank you for the question. The fee for new construction was not intended to cover the relocation of historic structures that we were actually trying to preserve.
So I guess if someone has a house that it's a, let's just say it's 1920s, 1930s house that, they would have the choice of preserving it or building something new, would it cost them $1,500 to move the house?
No, the fees were intended to reflect the time that is spent in the applications by staff. So that type of example that you've cited, while it happens, it doesn't happen very often, certainly not as often as the applications that we're receiving for new construction. So those fees were based on actual times that we are now spending on those types of applications. We wouldn't see, typically what we're trying to do is to have fees to incentivize historic preservation and appropriate work and disincentivize inappropriate work. So the relocation of a historic property that would save it would actually be something we would encourage, whereas the demolition of a historic property that we would want preserved is something that we would want to disincentivize.
Perfect. Okay, that's what I was hoping to hear. Thank you. Slide 39, I agree with, I think one of maybe Ms. Mendelson had said on the transportation issues, these signals and some of these, the striping that hasn't been done before or that we need to catch up on. I mean, this is, especially on the signals, I mean, this is a one-time capital investment. It would be great if we could find a way to just knock it out. I know that's easier than it sounds, but through a bond program or something along those lines, just to get that done and modernize. Slide 47, sanitation services. I got 3 emails about recycling not getting picked up while I was sitting here. And whatever it takes, please, let's get that fixed. Question on slide 53, Elizabeth, on what you're seeking input on. On the workforce development piece, does that include support for the hospitality industry, including our artists, our like tourism and restaurant industries? Because I know they were hit pretty hard through COVID.
Yes, it does, and I'm glancing through the guidance right now. They consider the impacted industries, tourism, travel, and hospitalities. And I'm looking to see if there are others, but I'm sure the arts are in there because they might have had a revenue loss, and so we could include them. But in terms of the impacted industries, aid may be considered responsive if it supports businesses, attractions, business districts, and tribal development districts operating prior to the pandemic and affected by closures. So I think that all of that, yes, would apply if they were affected by the pandemic.
Okay, so like the arts industry, the tourism, they'll all be consulted with this if there's going to be, okay, great. Slide 56, just want to echo what Chairman Thomas had mentioned about our homelessness. This is a game changer for providing transitional housing. I'm really proud of staff applying this much money towards, thank you TC, towards putting this much towards transitional housing for our homelessness. We have such a need in the city, as we've seen with all the briefings that Chairman Thomas has had and before that as well. And it will be fantastic if we can really make a dent in homelessness through this. And last question, slide 57, love the $37.4 million for getting water to people who don't have it. That we're not serving, but what is other investments in the future? What could that include? And I'm sorry if I missed that earlier, but I didn't hear that.
Well, so when I briefed in early May, I suggested using $20 million for economic development. And as we looked at the guidance which we received after that briefing, whereas the statutory language had said responding to the economic effects of COVID, and we read that to mean we could do economic development, the Treasury rule that has been released and the guidance since then has said, no, we don't mean general economic development. We mean specifically people who lost jobs or businesses and other groups that lost revenue. And so it's just a lot stricter than we had anticipated it would be just based on reading the statutory language. And therefore, that's that $20 million we had intended for economic development. We've got to go back and be thoughtful about how we can comply with the guidance and yet still support economic development. And so whether that's other water and sewer investments, maybe in areas that aren't necessarily occupied, but if we were to invest in the water and sewer, we could help a project make sense for developers in certain areas of the city that might not have it. That might be a way to support economic development. So it's a little bit of a TBD right now as we continue to work through all of the issues.
Ms. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for this, and I know we have a lot to learn, those of us who are new, certainly me. But my first question is a big one, and that is, do we articulate the values that this budget will reflect anywhere? Do we actually make statements about where we're trying to go with some of these big sections?
What we generally do in the budget is we will articulate some themes and some values, yes, but we're really reliant on those that have already been set by the City Council through your strategic planning retreats and others. And so we will be able to talk about things in the categories that generally align to your committees. So those 8 strategic priorities of the city, and we'll be able to present information in some tables that show, okay, how does it rack up under public safety or under housing and homelessness? We do that, but of course then we also talk about the city manager's 4 E's, the equity, excellence, ethics, and I'm sure I'm missing one. And then, so those are the kinds of things. And thematically, we have some there that we will articulate.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a couple of specific questions, if I may. And similar to Mayor Pro Tem West, on slide 20, where you start talking about fee review, that cost of recovery is from 2017. Do we have updated costs, or is that the cost as of now?
The updated cost is that last column, the full cost per unit. And so we did a fee study. We work with a contractor who helps us do these fee studies with the department. So we have external expertise working on time studies and other ways of monitoring and measuring how much it costs us to provide that individual service.
Okay, so then the 100%, for example, in the first one for 2017, it's 100% back then, but if we did 100%, that 591 on that very first one, so that's at 100% of today. Is that correct?
No. When the current fee is $264,
right.
When we studied that workload in 2017, the cost at that time was $264, and we made the decision to recover that cost at 100%. So we were at 100% cost recovery the last time we looked at the fee. Now we've looked at it, and it would be $591 if we were to stay at 100% cost recovery in the next budget.
Thank you. And then similar to on slide 24, back with historic preservation. So, and this, I guess, reflects the question about our values. So if we as a city say we really want to encourage historic preservation, and because those costs of recovery are not necessarily as clear, as easy to articulate, right? And we want to disincent people from tearing things down that are historically valuable. Are there ways that we can do that with fees if we're not certain about how that 100% is, since I know we can't capture more than 100%?
Right, and so, I mean, this is why they pay you the big bucks, Council, because you've got to make those decisions about what is the policy that you want to have versus the revenue that you would be giving up by not getting 100% cost recovery. And so that's always a balancing act. I will tell you, most of our fees, we recover at 100%, but we do make those decisions. You do make those decisions on occasion.
Okay, thank you. On the next slide where it says regarding the fee justice piece, where we have the alleviating the burden on more than 72,000 residents, do we have any numbers in terms of really having that be an equity scale? Because we want to make sure that some of the residents ought to have that fee, right?
So we will send you the memo to the WE committee so that you have it at the top of your email. Because it has a lot of data in the memo, and so some of that may answer some of your questions about how they looked at it from an equity perspective. And then if you have additional questions, we'll be happy to meet with you and talk through what that study entailed and answer any questions you've got.
Okay, thank you. And then on the 911 piece, is the $1.4 million all we actually need, or is that the money? Is there for the technology for 911?
Right.
I'm sorry, I didn't put the slide number.
No, that's okay. I've got it. And it is coming up here, Elizabeth. Well, anyway, I know what you're talking about. So that is just the technology. That doesn't have anything to
Right.
do with staffing.
Right.
And what we have been doing recently is getting to the next generation 911 network. And that has been an upgrade of all of our equipment, and also in a somewhat related way, update of all our public safety equipment to go from analog to digital and many things like that. And so we're in the middle of that. We need additional funding to do that. We usually use, and it's page 40, we usually use, we have some 911 revenue that comes in through fees on telephones and mobile phones, and then we supplement at times if needed. And so this is just acknowledging that we need to do another 1.4. We will work to figure out the funding for that, whether we're able to do it from the fees that are coming in or if we might need something more. But again, that number is only the technology, does not include any staffing. And frankly, the staffing is the bigger limitation on 911 response times than the technology.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make sure the $1.4 million that's all we need for the technology piece. And then my final question is, will people who participated in the teletown halls be contacted, or can we get those folks when we do our district town halls so they can be reached again to say, okay, now we're going to go into more detail with you?
We generally ask whether they want to sign up to be in our Gov delivery system where they will receive updates on various city things. And so we get that information from the vendor. And so when they register to attend the town hall, or if they can opt in for that, or if they're we do a call out and they stay on the line and participate in the call, we do offer them an option to hit a button and leave their information with us so we can add them to those lists.
And
so
then
to the extent they've opted in, yes.
And then we can get that information for our area ones, our district ones.
Right.
Right, okay, sorry. And there's one last question, and that is, will the budget have goals in terms of personnel on slide 28? So we have goals now for wage. Will later, when we get the bigger budget, are there any other personnel goals that we could add if we want them to live in Dallas, if we want to encourage them to use public transportation, things like that, new ideas that may support our personnel and support our city?
I'm certainly open to hearing those ideas from you. On the two that you mentioned, I will tell you we are not allowed to have a residency requirement.
Correct.
And the second one was public transit. And we do have a DART Pass program for employees that we have in the budget.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Deputy Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, Ms. Raish. I kind of want to highlight one particular page, and that's page 25. I hope this is also helpful to the body as a whole, but I know that Councilwoman Schultz asked about this. And so this topic is related to criminal justice debt and driver's license suspensions, which are often overlooked drivers of poverty and barriers to economic prosperity. And I have some experience with this. Just when I first started practicing law, I handled some municipal citations And so when fines and fees are not paid, the courts place omni-base holds on people's driver's licenses and typically don't lift the holds until the fines and fees are completely paid. This means that if a person is able to lift their warrants and get on a monthly payment plan, the holds remain until the debts are completely paid off, which could, in many instances, take years. And people with the means to pay a ticket can resolve it online or through the mail without ever having to appear in court. However, people without money are set on an entirely different course after receiving a ticket. When somebody who can't afford to pay their ticket misses court or a scheduled payment, many courts will issue a warrant and assess a number of costs and fees that only apply to people who don't pay right away. And I remember several instances coming out of the Dallas Municipal Courthouse feeling really badly for people who just didn't have $500 or $400 or $600 to be able to pay the fines or fees that they owe. And people with resources could get it out of the way and not even worry about it. And so, you know, if an individual fails to pay the debt, there can be devastating consequences. They can have difficulty finding employment and housing. They could be unable to pay and needing to drive to get to work regardless, or take their kids to school and otherwise care for themselves and their families. And many people continue driving with invalid licenses anyway, and which results in more tickets for driving without a license, along with additional costs and fees. And each year, thousands of Dallas residents become trapped in an endless cycle of growing debt, warrants, and jail time for unpaid court debt. If they stop driving, they could lose their jobs, their ability to care for their families, access to medical care, and any hope of ever paying off the fines and fees. And a lot of times these offenses are related to not having insurance, like I said, a valid license or up-to-date registration. These types of citations typically result from a lack of financial resources, while moving violations like speeding are committed by drivers of all income levels. So the Omnibase program hits low-income drivers the hardest. The program disproportionately punishes low-income residents of our city. The average person in the program must resolve over $1,000 in debt before they can get their license back. Another aspect of this is that Omnibase holds are concentrated in lower-income zip codes. The highest income zip codes generally have fewer holds. A correlation analysis revealed that a significant negative relationship between holds and median income. As zip code income increased, the number of holds decreased. Additionally, 4 zip codes in South and East Dallas, 75217, 75216, 75227, and 75241, were among the top 10 zip codes with the highest number of Omnibase holds placed by courts statewide over the course of a single year. All the zip codes with median incomes below the city's median income, and with residents who are predominantly people of color. Black and Hispanic drivers are much more likely to be impacted by Omnibase holds than white drivers. Data from the Dallas Municipal Court shows an even starker overrepresentation of black individuals. While black individuals make up only 25% of the Dallas population, almost 60% of Omnibase holds in Dallas were against black individuals in 2017. So opting out of the Omnibase program is a proven solution, and I was planning on discussing this. It wasn't just because of your question, but I think this is a way to remove a major obstacle for thousands of Dallas residents struggling to support themselves and their families. Helping people get out of debt and back on the road is a necessary step towards creating a more equitable city with widespread economic prosperity across all races and ethnicities and in all neighborhoods. So I'm really excited about this, TC. Thank you so much for this initiative. And that's all I have for this round, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Mr. McGue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Been a lot of good comments. I love the question about reflecting our values and how the budget is just one of the most important things that we deal with. And so I want to echo some of the comments as it relates to really focusing on some of our basics, and the most important components of living in the city of Dallas are feeling safe, being able to use our basic resources, our streets and infrastructure, our signals, our sanitation, 911 calls, paying our lowest property tax rate we can. Those are some of the basics that I hear on a regular basis. And I heard some of the discussion, and I want to just ask a question. On the public safety point of this, what is the plan right now for catching up on the market-based pay for our first responders.
So, Councilman, a couple of things I would hope we don't do today, and we're not going to get into specifics, particularly that relate to meet and confer. And so we will be reviewing where we are, obviously, as it relates to market, and then ultimately bringing forth, as a part of the budget, any salary recommendations associated with both uniform and non-uniform personnel. So I hope we don't spend too much time, and my staff wouldn't be put on the spot to probably not share as much as I just shared. But we're going to work through it, and there's no specifics that we want to share in open air. Thank you.
Okay, and then are there any, can we get into any specifics yet on resources that would tie into our Chief Garcia's violent crime reduction plan and how that?
So today's conversation, short of being able to answer what we can, is to really get feedback from council. We are looking at, as I've said, I think yesterday to many of the new city council members, the objective and goal, as I hope you will come to find, is as we've moved forward with whether it's crime plans, other master plans, CCAPs, and others, is that once we have council approve those plans, it's our expectation that you will see things coming out of and part of the budget that actually reflect getting done many of the things that are on those plans. And so, therefore, whether it's the mayor's task force for public safety or the crime plan, we'll be looking at those things and recommendations that come out of those things to fund things like lighting and other types of nuisance abatement things, as well as internal issues that the chief may need to make sure that he can do what his team needs to do. So yes, we'll be looking at all of that. I can't tell you today what that is because we're just now beginning the process of budget. But I would say this as a matter of sharing with council right now. It will absolutely be the best budget any of you have ever seen in your entire lifetime by we get time to August. So that's what we're looking for because you've challenged us to do more and better. So put that on a billboard. Thank you.
So much for under-promising and over-delivering. I will hold you to that, TC. And I guess just take my comments from the focus on the areas that we're mentioning. And I'd also like to see, it's been talked about extensively, but I'd like to see some drastic improvement on 911 call centers. I mean, and we heard the difference between technology and the staffing, but that's just one of those areas where we just got to get the best and the brightest and make that something that is not an issue that our city faces anymore. I would say the same thing about permitting. We've talked about that ad nauseum, but really addressing that issue. And really kind of piggyback on Councilmember Thomas's comments about workforce and wraparound services and how we really focus on helping people get out of crisis in this city and get the services that they need. And the last thing, I'll ask a question. I think, Elizabeth, on page 73, could you explain a little bit more about what we mean by non-departmental and explain that increase there?
Yes. Give me one moment to get to the page. Okay. So non-departmental is the account where we pay for citywide expenses. So a good portion of non-departmental is a payment to TIFs, right? And so that's where we're going to make our payments.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what that was. The payment to what?
TIFs, to our TIF districts.
Okay.
So a large portion is for TIF district payments. We also pay for example, the appraisal districts to do their work, to the tax office to collect our taxes, those kinds of things that don't fit within any one department. We fund from here. Citywide memberships, I think you're all familiar with that issue. We fund from non-departmental. So there's a lot in here, but it's not specific to any one department.
And can you just explain what the proposed almost $5 million increase is for?
You know, I wish I could right now, but off the top of my head, I cannot, but I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Willis.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. It's very good. First of all, just a request on the survey questions and the 65 plus exemption, if we could see district breakouts on that, or specifically D13, or really I'd like to know across all the districts if we can see those numbers. On page 6, and I think Councilmember McGue referenced something about permitting. I'm looking, it looks like our fiscal year 19 actuals generated over 6.5 million, and so we're looking at 22, and from plan to the update, it stayed almost flat. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that with regard to how we want to see that bounce back, and how you arrived at this.
So on that one, right, so on that one, I'll just point out, this is general fund revenue. The Department of Sustainable Development and Construction, the permitting operation is an enterprise fund. Right. So this revenue line does not include permits for those building permits that are under discussion. So this is a different set of licenses and permits that we charge.
I see. Okay, thank you. On page 22, when we're looking at codes and code fees, I was curious about those tiers. They don't seem very punitive for multiple violations.
I will ask Carl Simpson, Director of Code Compliance, to meet with you. He gave a briefing in April that the City Council was very supportive of. And so it's a complex topic. If there's a short answer, Carl, feel free to give it now. But I'm sure he'd love to have a discussion with you about what his proposal is. It's quite good and was received well. So
The city attorney wanted to say something to that point, if you don't mind. Then, by the way, new members, staff time never counts against your question time, just so you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. So with respect to fees, so our fees can only be to recoup our services. Otherwise, if they're beyond whatever the recoupment is, then it's considered a tax, and it's an illegal tax. So whenever we look at these fees, we look at, does it recoup our cost for implementing or monitoring the program? So you had mentioned that about fees, so I just wanted to point that out whenever we look at this discussion of fees and recoup of them.
Okay, I didn't see anything under current fee per unit that reflected what percentage of the cost it might be. That's why I thought maybe we had an opportunity on that one.
Sure, I mean, if you're not recouping 100%, you could, but it's just that you had mentioned about the fees, so I just tell the council that whenever you look at fees, it's only to recoup the city's cost in doing that particular program.
Mm-hmm. And it was specific to code.
Yes, this is a new program, so we don't have any current fees because we're not currently doing the work.
Okay. On page 37, we talk about our streets and the report card, the rating. And given the weather conditions we've had this past year, I think we assess this every 3 years. And so I was curious as to whether this might see more movement given the conditions this year, and whether that would help us with this imperative we feel around streets and alleys. But we could talk about that if there's any planning around that to review those.
Certainly. And I would ask Majid Al-Ghafri or Robert Perez to help me on responding to that, or meeting with you and discussing it.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
It was just about updating the assessment, given some of the conditions we suffered this past year, weather-wise, and how it might cause some streets to degrade more and accelerate the report card that we see, and whether that would help inform our decisions when we, get down to crunching these numbers.
Sure. So I'll let Robert elaborate on it, but every 3 years we actually update the entire city network in terms of the pavement condition index, or the pavement condition rating. Robert just completed all 4 quadrants, and I think he's going to a new model where we update the 3 portions of the city. So we're going to expand this to be a little bit more aggressive or progressive in doing that much faster, and do it every 3 years instead of 4 years. But I'll let Robert elaborate a little bit more.
Maggie said it perfectly, ma'am. We just finished the assessment this last year in preparation for the next bond. As we complete projects, we do update each of the scores on a monthly basis. We do that. So the next assessment probably won't be for another couple of years.
Okay, finally, one more. On page 50, you referenced $90 million in rental assistance. I'm wondering if we have any idea of what that universe is, of what's needed.
Jessica Galashaw, I know you're on the line. Would you like to address?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for that question. As far as the basis of the need, that has been something that's been a little bit hard to assess. However, there have been what is called these pulse surveys that have been conducted by the Census Bureau throughout the period of time that we've been dealing with the COVID. And those surveys have shown some results that show that as many as 12 to 15%, and they do them, once a month, or and they kind of focus for a week at a time. So there has been a little bit of transition. I don't have the data right in front of me, but they have shown that as many as 12 to 15% of residents who are renters are having concerns with their ability to pay the next month's rent, or are saying that they're going to be unable to do so. So when we've extrapolated that to kind of look at the residents here in the city of Dallas, we're expecting that that's in the thousands and potentially in the tens of thousands of residents that may have some level of concern when it comes to paying their rent. However, I will add the caveat that most of those surveys were done during the winter time, and so I don't have more recent data, and we have seen some improving economic conditions. However, based on the demand that we continue to see through all of our partnerships, we know that it's still out there and it's still very much needed.
Thank you.
Mr. Ridley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've been talking mostly about the expenditure side of the equation here this morning. I have a very basic question about the revenue side. During the campaign, I talked to a lot of people who complained about their tax bills going up. Why? Because their appraised values were skyrocketing. And I'd explain to them, the city has no control over your appraised value. We're not raising the tax rate. It's the county. They're raising your appraised values. And I think a lot of people are thinking, yeah, but the city is getting a huge windfall here. In numbers, it was $110 million from 2019 to 2021 in just 2 years. That's approximately 15% increase, even though we were marginally decreasing our tax rate. And so my question is, how much of our increased budget expenditure is due to pure inflation and to increase in population as opposed to an increase in services, so that I can explain to my constituents what we're doing with their increased taxes?
Thank you for the question. It's certainly an important topic and one that we've talked about a lot with everyone. So a couple of things. One, the increase year over year also includes new construction. Not all of it is a reappraisal. So the additional dollars that you see, about $20 million a year more has been from new construction. So some of that property tax revenue is coming from that. It doesn't take care of the entire amount. And then for the others, yes, reappraisals do fall in to that, and so that's why we've worked hard to raise that senior exemption and to do some other things. We are not allowed by state law to have a separate rate for commercial and residential. So we do know though that our homestead exemption and those senior exemptions are important ways to try and help out the residential homeowners. In terms of how does inflation generally affect our budget? Well, when 70% of your budget is personnel and you've got wage increases and the cost of benefits increasing, certainly that plays in because those are higher increases generally, especially for healthcare. And in the case of our police and fire pension system, that has gone up quite significantly in the last few years because of our commitment to saving that pension. So 70% of our general fund being personnel, that drives a lot of it. Other types of expenses have gone up as well. And so we can have a conversation about what that is. Some of the most recent expense changes are on the capital side, so you wouldn't see that reflected in the general fund budget exactly because it's happening in those capital projects paid for with bond dollars or other things. But yes, costs do go up. I don't have the data in front of me as to kind of breakouts of how much they've gone up and how that's compared to, say, CPI. However, it's certainly a factor that our costs do go up. So it's not necessarily an increase in services. It's what we need to maintain the service level. But we've had some investments, and last year in particular, investing in things like Right Care and in some other initiatives around real change that we've been able to put into the budget, even in years where it's been hard.
So what proportion of that increase in the budget would you say is attributable to inflation as opposed to service increase?
No?
Sorry, I was hearing some other talking. So what portion is inflationary costs versus new services?
Yes.
I'll have to get back to you with an answer on that. I'm looking at staff that's in the room here, and I don't know that we have an immediate answer available. So let me do some looking and get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Basil Dua, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted some clarification. If you can go to slide 6. On the revenue sources, there seems to be a pretty substantial decrease on some of the line items, and I wanted to see if you could give us a little bit further guidance to why on the franchise and other. It seems like we're about $35 million under what we were in 2019 between franchise and other fines and forfeitures, miscellaneous, and interest. And I also know licenses and permits by large has to do with the pandemic, but I also know that we don't help our ability to get more revenue there. So I think that that's going to be worked on. But with the other 4 line items, can you just explain why we've seen such substantial drops?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. I didn't go into franchise in this presentation. I will in August to explain this. But essentially what we're seeing is just a degradation of that revenue source, in part because of state action, the state legislature changing what we're able to do, and particularly not in this session, but in the session 2 years ago, changing so that providers only had to pay one of the franchise fees they owe and not all of them. And so it's a complex issue that is affected by state legislation. It's also affected by the fact that folks are moving from analog and cable systems at their homes into more digital and streaming. And that's having an effect on things. As the telecommunications, we move from landlines to mobile. That has an effect as well. So I will be laying out what we're expecting and what we're seeing in terms of franchise fees and talk about that more in August. I didn't do that in this presentation, but happy to chat with you in the meantime on that one as well.
And before you move to the next one, Elizabeth, are we being proactive as far as the franchise, our capability with franchise on getting more of what we should be entitled to?
Yes, and I think that with streaming and other providers, it's really important to note too that they are essentially operating as a franchise.
Yeah.
And so we're always looking at what we need to do to make sure we have the money to run the city when the content is going over the wires that make use of our right-of-way.
Thank you for that.
Charges for service is really pandemic driven, and particularly in FY20, those actuals. And then I will say that in the 21 budget, we thought we'd have more recovery in terms of charges for service, and we just are not seeing it. So that's why our FY21 forecast is only at that 100 million. These are things like in the rec centers, we might charge for rental of a room, in the library, et cetera. So those are some examples of charges for service. Licenses and permits. I don't have a good explanation for that. I'm sure that as we're looking at our cost recovery and things like that and making decisions, or I'll have to get more information on exactly what's feeding those numbers. On interest, the answer is that the Fed lowered interest rates to pretty much zero. And so while we were getting really good interest in 1920, and then we budgeted for good interest in 21, what we're actually receiving because rates are close to zero is pretty low. And so though our planned budget had a similarly large interest revenue, we will need to reduce that. It will not stay at $4.4 million. It's got to come down because with the way rates are going and the fact that at least for 2 more quarters, the Fed's not looking at raising rates, I don't think it's reasonable to budget at that level.
Okay, and what about fines and forfeitures?
Oh, it's what? Court fines are going down. And so that's really what's happening over time from FY19 into 20. So we had, of course, courts were closed. We also suspended some collection activities, I believe. And so we're seeing that play through a little bit there.
Okay. And the American Recovery Act, we have the ability to utilize funding to this time to compensate for lost revenue, correct?
Precisely. So there is a methodology laid out in the Treasury rule, and we are working with our financial advisors following that methodology to ensure that when we do the calculation, it will withstand audit. And so we're working through that. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of consternation because that methodology requires we be on a calendar year basis, and many cities and states are not on their fiscal year doesn't match the calendar year. So it's a little difficult comparing year to year when it's using a different time period than we ordinarily use for our financial systems and documents. So there's some discussion about whether that methodology will change. And so at this point, we're shoring up our calculations based on what's currently the methodology. If it changes, we'll need to adjust those a little bit. By August, for sure, I'll be able to come back and tell you our estimate of what that lost revenue is and how we're going to.
Okay, thank you very much for those answers. About the franchise fee, I'm just curious. I know that this is a little, I guess, off germane, but you mentioned any use of the right-of-way. Does this also apply to, in addition to, I guess, the sales tax for online shopping?
So it's not the same thing. So you're referring to the Supreme Court decision in Wayfair, which said that we should be collecting sales taxes for online sales. It set up a system of equity, really, between brick and mortar retailers and online retailers, which is really critical to ensure that we have that kind of equity in place. The state has implemented Wayfair to the extent that they are now charging online retailers sales tax and collecting that. However, the state and the state legislature have declined to make the change that would make a big difference for the city of Dallas. They have declined to have the shipping address determine where that sales tax goes. So instead, if there is a distribution facility in the state of Texas, that city will receive the revenue from that sales tax. So it's an origination address, not the shipping address. So when you have a big metro area like the city of Dallas with lots of online shopping, we're taking a hit for other metropolitan or places with distribution, sometimes even rural areas that just happen to have a distribution center. So the state legislature did not address that in our favor this year. We worked on the issue, and not able to get there. But certainly in the future, we hope that the state comptroller will make that change.
All right. And okay, I can get with you offline on to further that, because I'm curious. I mean, it looks like we're going to be taking even bigger hit if the trend continues to the ratio of in-person to online shopping. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I don't see anyone else in the queue. Is there anyone else who wanted to ask a question before we adjourn?
Mendelson.
Ms. Mendelson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Back to page 53 with the items in the yellow. Are you intending to revoke the health authority for Dallas County?
I don't see those words on the page. So, I mean, I don't know that that's part of this discussion. What I'm intending to do is to use the American Rescue Plan money to help the community in terms of health and safety.
Right. So the reason why I'm asking that is because you are seeking to fund mental health, which is clearly something we have contracted with the county to provide and has additional state resources. As somebody who led an organization whose main focus is mental health, I was on the board for 15 years. This is an issue I'm highly committed to, but we have given that to the county, and I'm concerned that we're spending dollars that should be city-focused on things that are for the county to address, and they have funding to do so. So, you know, the North Texas Behavioral Health is the organization that should be addressing the mental health resources, and so I'm concerned about spending some of our dollars there. The other thing I would talk about is for the Omnibase and Scofflaw that Deputy Mayor Pro Tem Resendez was talking about. Is that something that's going to come to a vote? I watched the WE meeting, and it was a less than 4-minute conversation, and they did not vote on that item. Is that something that's going to come to us on an agenda?
Well, yes, because all of our fees and policies around this are part and parcel to the budget. So this is a good opportunity for me to remind the City Council that when you consider the budget and you're adopting the budget, once you've taken that vote to adopt the budget, all of the other 8 or 9 items that follow are tied to that budget. There's an item on fees, there's an item on the tax rate, there's an item on the tax revenue, there's an item on personnel and others as well. And so once the budget is adopted, we have made the changes to those other items to tie to it. And so you're really needing to adopt all of those other items in order to effectuate the budget that you've just adopted.
So this item has never been highlighted previously. It's just been a policy or a practice? Can you tell me which?
The Scofflaw and Omnibase? Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, so it has been a way that we have ensured people come in to take care of business. And I also want to remind everybody that you don't have to pay necessarily. There are other ways the municipal court allows you to dispose of your citations and fines and fees with community service. And so there are some other options. Really what we want is for people to come. We want them to come talk to us at the municipal court and determine how they're going to handle their obligation, whether that is just paying it or whether that's something else we can work with them to do. And it's been one way to kind of compel them to come in.
So the way you have this on your presentation, it sounds like we would not be reporting to them anymore. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
But you're also saying that it's been useful to compel people to come and talk.
Well, and as you can see by the fact that we're estimating a $700,000 reduction in revenue, yes, it does result in some people paying those. And so this is the policy decision that the council is making, and that is, is this important enough to the city council that our policy be that for this particular purpose, we do not want to engage in reporting these citations to those databases.
Okay, but I don't see where we've had that policy discussion. There was a memo with, like I said, less than 4 minutes conversation in one committee, and the full council has not had a policy conversation about it. So I'm asking if it's going to be on an agenda.
Well, it will be in the budget. When we don't budget for $700,000 in revenue, then, that's certainly an opportunity for the policy discussion.
So you're expecting we're going to have a policy discussion about a $700,000 line item?
So, thank you, Elizabeth, for trying to
Go ahead,
answer
Mr.
that.
Mayor.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just happy to be back here with the microphone.
I know. We're happy to be together. Go ahead.
So, a couple of things. I think it's a timing issue as well now. Obviously, there are no more council briefings beyond today on that particular item. So, by the time we get to August, it will be very close to budget time, and that will be the discussion, I guess. Since we all happen to be here right now, I think the conversation could be discussed on whether or not that would be a priority that council, as we've laid out, as it relates to where we're going to reduce the revenue, that if that's something that there is consensus or concern with today while we have the entire body here, could suffice similar to a briefing as it relates to giving us some guidance and direction. And so if it's not desirous for us to eliminate the revenue and or to continue to report to Omnibase, if council looks and nods and shares with me, obviously you can't vote on it at a briefing, that's something we don't want to eliminate, then we won't eliminate it. If it's something that council supports based on that discussion, then say yes, proceed as it is. So I think today is a perfect opportunity for you to share with us what your sentiments are. And I would appreciate that today, given where we are in the timing, because I think we've perceived the direction previously as that's something that council has supported, as you've asked us to look at library fines and other types of reductions as a part of a cohort that we were, I think, with 4 to 6 other cities, that's the direction that we were going as a city that was concerned about the impacts of some of these things on people who cannot afford them, and it removes them from other opportunities, whether it's participating in city services or in some cases preventing them, as Councilmember Resendez says, or Deputy Mayor Pro Tem, may prevent them from even going to work and or losing their jobs because of things that happen in the cascading elements of what happens to them because of government structure. So I'd love to have the conversation today.
Right, so if we're only utilizing our 9 minutes of conversation for all of this budget discussion, I think for a whole nother policy discussion to be included within that 9 minutes is a little bit unfair. It's also like a 25-page memo that I'm not sure everybody has had a chance to read, but my concern with it is that it de-incentivizes people to maintain car insurance, car registration. The threat for physical assault is waived. So there's some real concerns about then why would anybody have car insurance? And, if you've ever been hit by somebody who didn't have insurance, you know how difficult this process can be. Same thing for a number of other items. Some of the information is characterized as being unfair to low income, but it's actually even above our median income for the city. We are a city that has a very low median income. So, I think there's a lot of things to look at this, and it deserves more than the time that I am allowed. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, and you'll be for 5 minutes, I guess. No, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question is regarding, it's page 59, Elizabeth, do we have any data from the town hall meetings on those recommendations from those who participated on how we should prioritize usage of the ARPA funds?
We had some discussion about it. We had some questions about it, but we did not do a polling question. I don't think, other than to ask, how had COVID affected them in terms of their financial situation, and are they having trouble paying for necessities?
So it was a general Q&A, and people could ask and give feedback. We didn't have anything specifically documented. Okay, and then is Liz Sadie on the line?
Good afternoon, the City of Pereira.
Hey, Liz, how are you doing? This will be.
I'm doing
brief.
great. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. This
Sure.
will be brief. I couldn't remember when we had the We Committee meeting and this regarding the fine and fees. I know you've been probably listening. One, was that an action item on the agenda? And if it was, do you remember what the recommendation of the committee was?
It was for information, and the thought was behind that, Chair Thomas, was that it would be considered, as CFO Rach has stated, in the budget deliberations.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one thing I forgot to mention is, and I think someone else did, but I want to second it, is that we do have a bicycle master plan, and it has never been fully funded in accordance with the plan, and we really need to try to find the money in the budget to at least hit the number that was targeted for this year and then play catch up later on. Thank you.
Mr. Basildua, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to get clarification on this item with the fees. This is equivalent to other budget exercises that we've had to come up as a discussion, correct? I mean, this isn't a policy discussion.
Mayor? Yes, thank you, Councilman. It is, but I think this is a little different in this regard, is that there has been some pre-conversation through participation, and Liz Sedale can chime in, on the city looking at a multitude of things that impact people who are of low income.
Equity indicator.
And fees and other things as a part of, again, a national understanding of how to approach those from a city perspective, particularly given some of the recent things that have happened with other cities and how things have been punitive. So that's one piece that's different, but this part that's the same and similar is every year council reviewing fees and recommendations and what we propose to do. This just happens to be driven by a broader policy discussion, whether small, long, or indifferent, and a perspective of us as a part of a normal cohort and a group of other large cities. So that's why we're coming forward, having gone to council, and then ultimately making a recommendation. And bright lights today saying there will be a $700,000 loss based on some of the discussions about how we've approached fees. So that's the only difference, is that we're calling it out today, and no different than we just talked about fees for concessions and vendors. We're just sharing with you the uptick in those because it is a substantial amount of resources, and it was driving some of the miscellaneous revenue increases. And so we wanted to share that today. But to Councilwoman Middleton's point, I'm not sure if the broader council had that philosophical discussion. I know there is some concern with some of the judges about not having the tools in their toolbox to force people to do certain things. But I think we've been very selective, I believe, in what things we've chosen not to report based on the sensitivity or the seriousness of them, but I'll have to defer to staff. But there's nothing unusual about it today. I think to Councilwoman Middleton's point is, though, that there may be some concern about revenue loss and wanting to understand the policy ramifications and the impacts on things that might impact other people who may not be as interested in reducing fees. So I think that's the only difference.
Can we have a more robust breakdown in a memo than what was provided for so that we can accomplish what you just said and still have deliberation and time? I can see, I mean, without committees, it is a policy. But I also feel like it's just a regular budget item, and so if we're going to just lay it out, I think that we should at least have that opportunity.
Again, I'll have to look at the scheduling of it and not.
Well, that's why I said by memo.
Again, I think the memo that was provided is probably pretty detailed. I'm not sure how much more we could provide, but we'll go back and look at it and see what we can share. The reality is we're going to spend a month and a half on the overall budget, and I think maybe during one of the budget conversations, if it's dialed in the way we're proposing it today, that can be an elongated conversation during one of our budget work sessions. But I'll defer to Elizabeth Rach or Liz Cedillo to share with me what the best course might be.
Thank you. For the record, I do support the change that was made. I just want to make sure that everybody is on board for us to actually move forward with it, because this is something that definitely speaks to equity. I also think it addresses our priority regarding some enforcement. One of the things that was mentioned was, I just was hit with somebody without insurance, so I do get that. As much as I get that, I think that that's strictly under the state's jurisdiction to worry about. And so if we're going to start talking about where we should be putting our resources and our funding specific to mental health as something that was just brought up, I don't think that we should be looking at ways that we can jump into the other realms that is not in our local jurisdiction. I mean, our law enforcement will enforce the laws that are there by the state, but in order to be an argument that it's to make the streets safer because people have insurance, I feel like that's really stepping out of our bounds, and would like for us to really focus on what our job is locally, which is addressing a lot of these inequities where we can help our residents of Dallas. So that's my opinion to the subject. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I don't see anyone else in the queue.
I'm in the queue.
Mr. Resendez.
Yeah, just
Deputy
really
Mayor Pro
quick.
Tem, and then, actually, hold on one sec, I'm sorry. I have to look at my little sheet here. I think I need to go to Ms. Arnold first, because she hasn't spoken at all. So, Ms. Arnold, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Excuse me, thank you. I'm just listening to some parts of the comments, in the mental health piece kind of piqued my interest, mainly because I remember speaking probably a year ago about the fact that post-COVID, we were going to witness quite a bit of mental health issues that we need to address. It's a reality. It's a reality in the sense that that many have gone through a much more traumatic experience than any of us sitting probably around this horseshoe, or perhaps our relatives. But I believe, as we talked about also with the social justice movement and wanting the police to be rerouted from some of those incidents involving mental health, I don't think I'm hearing it correctly that some are saying that we should not tackle this issue, because it is something that we're going to see more of in terms of calling for right care or calling for the police, when social justice and the real plan talked about moving toward addressing those issues that were discussed with the social justice statements. So I would say to the city manager, could you clarify, are you hearing what I'm hearing, that we should not embrace efforts to address mental illness? Is that what you heard? I just want to make sure before I move forward.
I didn't hear it the way you said it.
Okay.
But I did hear Councilwoman Mendelson say that we are paying other organizations, whether the county or another group, to focus on mental health, and we probably should spend our resources elsewhere. I have heard that, and I heard that, but
Well, I just want to be clear, so as I move forward into the community, because I'm going to push for the services that we need to partner, and perhaps we need to begin looking at the bigger picture, once again working with other jurisdictions, because this is not just a City of Dallas issue. It is an issue that affects us, excuse me, on all levels. And so as the president has rolled out this Recovery Act, or whatever you want to call it, and there's some just called a stimulus package, but the assistance, part of what I've seen in his package dealt with health and welfare. And so I think we need to take it upon ourselves to recognize and accept the fact that as we talk about mental health, that's also connected to homelessness. You have mental health issues populating as fast as I can say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, because they're put out, these individuals have been placed out on the streets now because they don't have a place to live. They have no job. So I don't know that certain levels, or you have different levels of mental illness that we choose to embrace, but I do know at the end of the day, it's going to affect public safety, it's going to affect education, it's going to affect just day-to-day operations as it relates to a city. So I know that if we have an opportunity to partner up with other jurisdictions and our agencies, I think we need to do that, because we cannot afford to strap our police officers with the challenge of the criticism, once again, of being the first responders. We need to also tap into what District Attorney Judge Crusoe is saying, as he talks about addressing mental illness and making arrests and what have you. So I think we need to take care of business as a city and do what we can to take care of those individuals who are looking for us to do that. So I did want to put that on in this conversation, since I thought I heard a little pushback on our responsibility, or at least our response to the call for help. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just really briefly want to state that not participating in the Omni-based system does not remove the requirement for an individual to have insurance, registration, a valid license. It just actually makes it more likely that an individual would have the capacity to work and have the funds for them to be able to have those things. And Class C should be, I mean, this is more philosophical. Class Cs are designed to be punished by fine only, but utilizing the Omni-based system, I think, helps create a situation where people are being punished by jail time. And so by stopping the use of the Omni-based system, we should see some savings in terms of the arrests that are being made and the time that people are spending in our jail. So those are just some of the factors to consider. Thank you.
I'm just going to adjourn the meeting unless somebody stops me. All right.